You're stepping off the dock before the last color leaves the sky. The oars bite the water in clean, practiced strokes, and behind you the shoreline shrinks into a necklace of lamps and laughter. The men around you speak softly, not because they're afraid of being heard, but because they like the feeling that the sea itself is listening. A lantern swings at the bow, painting faces in quick flashes. A ring with a carved gem, a mouth stained dark with wine, a hand that doesn't quite stop shaking. Somewhere ahead, an island sits low and black against the horizon, and the closer you get, the more you realize it isn't darkness you're sailing into. It's permission. Only after the boat kisses stone does the scene make sense. This is the Bay of Naples, the glittering edge of Roman luxury, and the era is the early empire, when the city of Rome ruled continents, but could still pretend it didn't know what its richest men did when the roads ended. The mainland villas at Baiae were already infamous, a resort of steam baths, gambling, and appetites that didn't fit inside the Senate speeches. But offshore, scattered like secrets, were smaller places with fewer witnesses. Not grand imperial showcases like Capri, but private holdings owned, leased, shared, inherited spaces that existed inside Rome's reach, yet slightly outside Rome's gaze. And that is where the story turns disturbing, because the real power of those islands wasn't the pleasure they offered. It was the way they made cruelty feel administrative, the way they made a human life feel like a line item, the way an empire that wrote laws about virtue could build a world where virtue was something you enforced on the poor, while the sea swallowed everything else. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Honestly, it still amazes me that stories buried under ancient silence can reach living rooms all over the world. The first thing to understand is how ordinary the departure looked. It didn't begin with masks or cloaks or theatrical villainy. It began with schedules. A senator finishes his obligations. A merchant prince closes his accounts. An ambitious provincial decides tonight is the night he becomes one of them. The invitation doesn't say anything explicit. It never does. It uses the language of culture and evening symposium, a retreat of friends, a philosophical gathering where the wine is good and the conversation better. Everyone understands the code because everyone needs the code. A written confession would be dangerous. A wink, a phrase, an understanding passed through networks of men who all have something to lose that's safer than honesty. On the docks, the boats are private, sleek, and quiet. They leave after dusk because darkness isn't just cover. It's theater. The sea air cools the skin, and that cooling feels like cleansing. They can tell themselves this is an escape from Rome's pressure, Rome's eyes, Rome's endless performance of honor. They can tell themselves that out there, beyond the lamplight, they will finally be real. But real is rarely what it claims to be. Sometimes it's just what you become when no one can stop you. The islands themselves weren't magical, not at first glance. Some were small enough that a man could walk the perimeter in minutes, hearing waves strike rock on both sides like a heartbeat. Others were large enough to hold multiple villas, staff quarters, storage rooms, gardens that turned inward, and bathhouses warmed by hidden furnaces. The architecture mattered. It wasn't built only for beauty. It was built for separation communal halls for feasting and performance, corridors that bent so you couldn't see ahead, doors that led to private cubicula where sound could be smothered by thick walls and the ocean wind. A place designed so that if anyone ever asked, a guest could claim he saw nothing. He heard nothing. He knew nothing. And on these islands, the economy of pleasure didn't revolve around wine or music, even if those were always present. It revolved around bodies, not metaphorically, literally. Rome had an entire legal category for it. Enslaved people were property. They were tools that spoke. Their pain was not a crime against them. It was damage to someone else's investment. That single idea, cold, simple, and accepted, turns the entire story from scandal to system. Because once you can own a person, you can rent a person. You can grade a person. You can assign a price based on age, appearance, origin, and training. You can build a business model where a living human being is both the product and the disposable packaging. The supply chain didn't begin on the island. It began in markets that smelled like sweat and brine and fear. It began after wars, raids, debts, and hunger. It began with a child pulled from a home that will never be named in any surviving record. And then it moved through hands that specialized in selection. Dealers who didn't need to be told what the island clients wanted, because demand had taught them certain ages, certain faces, certain accents, certain skills. The empire was vast enough to make variety itself a luxury. And luxury always finds a way to monetize variety. What's horrifying is not simply that this happened. History is full of cruelty, but how efficiently it could happen. A wealthy Roman could treat an island visit like any other indulgence. Pay the entry fee, pay for the food, pay for entertainment, pay more for something private. The money goes from guest to operator. From operator to dealers, from dealers to ships, from ships to training houses on the mainland, from training houses to boats that cross at night. It's a pipeline built from coin and silence. Training houses, if that phrase makes your stomach tighten, it should were meant to polish the product. A slave destined for hard labor needed strength. A slave destined for elite pleasure needed something else. Language, posture, performance. They learned how to pour wine without trembling, how to smile on command, how to recite poetry in Greek or Latin, how to dance in ways that made older men feel young and powerful. They learned the etiquette of obedience, which is just a refined way of saying they learned what punishment would do to them if they failed. And then when the season came, when the sea calmed and the rich began migrating to the coast like predators to a feeding ground boats, carried these trained bodies offshore. Imagine the first night for someone newly arrived, not the first night for the guests, for the enslaved. The boat ride is short, but it feels like exile. The coastline is visible, so close it's almost cruel. You can see lights. You can smell cooking fires on the wind. You can hear faint music drifting across water if the night is still. Freedom is within sight, and that proximity becomes a kind of torture, because it teaches you exactly how unreachable it is. When the boat lands, staff separate people into roles with the ease of habit. Some are set to serve in the feast hall, where the first hours will be public performance, smiles, refilled cups, compliments murmured into powerful ears. Others are sent to baths, where warm water and oil are used not as comfort, but as ceremony, preparing guests like offerings. Others are taken to smaller rooms and told, without explanation, to wait. Waiting is its own violence. Your mind fills the silence with possibilities. The walls are thick, the sea is loud, and somewhere in the building you hear laughter that doesn't sound like joy. It sounds like ownership. The guests arrive dressed for display, tunics, cloaks, jewelry that catches lantern light. They bring gifts not because the island needs them, but because gifts are part of the ritual of superiority. Rare wine, exotic spices, perfumed oils, musicians, dancers, they bring the illusion of a festival to disguise what the festival is for. The feast begins. It always begins with a feast, because Romans understood something timeless. People excuse themselves more easily after they've been fed. Wine loosens shame. Food creates gratitude. Music tells the body to relax. They'd call it a symposium borrowing Greek tradition, like a mask that makes them feel cultured rather than cruel. They talk about philosophy. They quote poets. They argue about virtue in voices thick with drink, and the irony is so sharp it could cut stone. And then the performances start. At first it might look almost respectable, at least from a distance. A dancer reenacts a myth. A musician plucks strings that make the room shimmer. An acrobat twists into shapes that draw applause. The enslaved performers are praised like art, which is another way of denying their humanity. Then the clothing changes. Then the choreography changes. Then the myth being performed stops being about gods and becomes about permission stories where a powerful being takes what he wants, because the story says he can. Leda, Ganymede, any tale that can be repurposed as justification. And the guests laugh because laughter is the sound of a conscience putting on armor. This is the first curiosity spike, the first moment the story shifts from decadence to something darker. The islands weren't just places where wealthy Romans did shameful things. They were places where shame was engineered out of the experience. Everything was designed to make the guests feel normal. Everything was designed to make the enslaved feel inevitable. And that's why the islands were more disturbing than you think. They weren't a chaotic riot of desire. They were organized. There were rules, not moral rules. Operational ones. Schedules for arrivals and departures, so no curious eyes on the mainland could follow patterns. Rotations of enslaved people between properties to keep novelty high and attachments low. Ledgers that tracked income and expenses with the same neat handwriting used for olive oil and marble. The rich like their sins clean, and nothing is cleaner than paperwork. One human anchor helps us feel the emotional weight. Imagine a young enslaved attendant. Let's call him Lucanus, not because we know his name, but because Rome's records rarely bothered to preserve the names of the enslaved. He's 14 or 15. He's been taught to speak carefully, to keep his eyes down unless commanded otherwise, to smile like a door opening. Tonight he is assigned to the feast hall. He stands behind a reclining guest and pours wine in measured amounts, because too much too fast makes the guest sick, and sickness ruins the mood. He learns the guest's hierarchy quickly. He can tell who is important by who speaks without being interrupted. He can tell who is insecure by who jokes the loudest. He can tell who is cruel by who touches him, as if testing the texture of a cloth. A guest calls him closer. The guest asks where he's from. It's a question that sounds like curiosity, but is really a reminder. Your origin is a novelty for my amusement. Lucanus answers with whatever he was taught to say. The guest laughs not because the answer is funny, but because the act of asking makes him feel benevolent. Later, when the feast hall grows hazy with smoke and wine, someone announces games. The Greeks had games at symposia, playful contests. The Romans love that idea because it lets them pretend they're participating in tradition, not exploitation. A cup is thrown into a basin. A man bets he can hit a target. Another bets he can drink more without collapsing. And then the prize is offered. Not a wreath, not a silver coin, a person. Lucanus watches this and understands with a clarity that makes him cold inside that the laughter is not about entertainment. It's about power made casual. As the night deepens, the public hall fractures into private routes. Guests rise, swaying slightly, and follow staff down corridors. Doors open, doors close. The music continues in the main hall to cover what happens elsewhere. The sea continues outside, endless and indifferent. Now comes the second curiosity spike. The true value of an island wasn't just discretion. It was jurisdictional ambiguity and practical isolation. On the mainland, rumors could spread. Neighbors could notice. A wronged family could complain, at least in theory. Offshore, the water created a boundary that felt like a legal eraser. Even if Roman law technically extended there, enforcement depended on people willing to speak. But speaking meant accusing the powerful. And accusing the powerful in Rome was a good way to lose your career, your property, your life. So silence wasn't just encouraged, it was ensured. Every guest who attended became compromised. The islands created a closed loop of mutual vulnerability. You don't expose me, because exposing me exposes you. That is how elite cruelty protects itself. Not through secrecy alone, but through shared guilt. And then there's the staff, free workers, overseers, boatmen, who kept the entire machine running. They were paid well. They were selected for loyalty. They understood that their livelihood depended on their discretion. Some might have told themselves they were just doing a job. Others might have enjoyed the power they were given over the enslaved. Either way, the result was the same. The islands functioned like private states, where the only law was profit, and the only morality was whatever kept the patrons returning. Lucanus eventually is taken from the feast hall. A servant leads him to a small room. The room is not decorated with obvious cruelty. That's the point. The Romans didn't need chains on the walls to prove ownership. Ownership was already total. The room has a couch, a lamp, a basin of water. It looks like any bedroom in any villa, which is a different kind of horror, because it means brutality can happen in ordinary spaces without announcing itself. The guest enters. The guest speaks softly, almost kindly. Kindness can be a weapon here. The guest might offer wine. The guest might offer food. The guest might offer a compliment. And then the guest will do what he came to do. And Lucanus will survive it, because survival is what the enslaved are forced to become experts at. One night becomes many. The season continues. But the islands don't only consume, they discard. This is the third curiosity spike, the moment that turns the story from disturbing to haunting. What happens when the product is damaged? The logic of the system answers without emotion. If a person is too old by the island's standards of desire, they lose value. If they are injured, they lose value. If they become ill, they become a risk. If they resist, they become inconvenient. And in a world where they are property, inconvenience is often treated the way you treat any broken tool. Some could be sold back to mainland brothels or households. Some could be redirected into labor. But for those who were too conspicuous, too damaged, too exhausted, or simply too burdensome, the sea offered a solution that required no paperwork and left no grave. A boat leaves at night, not carrying senators now, but carrying weighted bundles. The oars are quiet. The lantern is dim. The crew doesn't speak much, because speaking would make the act real in a way silence does not. They row to deeper water, to a place where currents move like invisible hands. The weight goes over the side. There is a splash. Then nothing, except the water closing like a mouth. And the next evening the feast hall fills again. If you want to understand the moral contradiction of Rome, you have to hold two images at once. On the mainland, in the city, senators debate laws about marriage and virtue. Emperors issue moral reforms. Public punishments are staged as lessons. Rome calls itself civilized. Rome calls itself lawful. And offshore, in the same empire, men with those same rings and titles treat children as rentable entertainment and treat bodies as waste to be disposed of in deep water. It's not the existence of vice that makes this uniquely disturbing. It's the coexistence of virtue and vice as policy virtue for the public, vice for the powerful, and the sea as the border between the two. For years it works. The Bay of Naples remains beautiful, and beauty is part of the seduction. Warm air, sparkling water, villas carved into cliffs. The guests return because returning is easy. Guilt is softened by repetition. A man can do something once and feel sick with himself. A man can do something 50 times and call it tradition. And then, one day, the sky changes. It begins with tremors small enough to dismiss. The Bay region had always been restless. Earthquakes were not unheard of. Wealthy people have an incredible talent for treating warning signs as inconveniences. But then the air thickens. A strange cloud rises in the distance. The light turns wrong, like a theater lamp shifted by a careless hand. Mount Vesuvius erupts. Ash begins to fall like dark snow. The sea churns strangely, as if the water itself is confused. On the mainland, people run through streets that become corridors of choking dust. Roofs collapse. Animals scream. The wealthy flee their villas, clutching jewelry and family idols, trying to carry their lives in their arms. Offshore, on the islands, the routine shatters. The operators realize their patrons are gone. The boats are needed elsewhere. The supply lines break. Staff scatter. Some enslaved people are left behind, not because anyone decides to abandon them with dramatic cruelty, but because abandonment is what happens when you were never considered a person in the first place. The empire is busy saving citizens. Property can be replaced. That is the logic. The eruption doesn't just bury Pompeii and Herculaneum. It buries networks. It buries routines. It buries the illusion that the world will keep accommodating Rome's appetites forever. And yet, in a cruel twist, the same disaster that ends the island system also preserves traces of it. Ash can destroy, but it can also seal. In cities entombed by volcanic fury, mundane documents can survive accounts, contracts, lists, ordinary paperwork frozen in time, not dramatic confessions, not poetic testimonies from the enslaved, just records that prove, in the most unemotional way possible, how normal exploitation was to those who profited from it. The psychological aftermath is harder to measure, because the people who suffered most were the least likely to leave written traces. The powerful can rewrite themselves. They can move to new villas. They can claim piety. They can sponsor temples. They can commission statues that make them look wise and humane. Memory in elite hands becomes a tool of laundering. But the place remembers differently. The Bay of Naples remains a tourist paradise across centuries. Boats still cross the water at dusk. Laughter still rises from restaurants along the shore. The islands still sit in the same positions, catching the same sunsets. And that's what makes the legacy feel like a ghost. The scenery is unchanged enough to trick you into imagining the past as romantic, when in truth the past was built from human lives treated as expendable. Some islands shift, erode, or even submerge over long spans of geological time. Stone gives way. Coastlines change. What was once a platform for private cruelty can become a fisherman's stop, a quiet ruin, a place where children play without knowing what happened under their feet. History doesn't always end with justice. Sometimes it ends with forgetting. But forgetting isn't the same as innocence. Because if you stand on a dock in that bay today, you can still watch the sea darken at sunset. You can still picture the lantern swaying on a boat's bow. You can still imagine how easy it was for a man to step into that boat and tell himself he was leaving the world of laws behind. You can still imagine Lucanus nameless in the records, vivid in the human mind standing in lamplight, learning the shape of his own captivity. They remembered enough to build it. They recorded enough to profit from it. They erased enough to sleep at night. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not that these Roman pleasure islands existed, but that they fit so smoothly inside a civilization that also gave us poetry, engineering, philosophy, and law. The same hands that wrote about virtue could sign a ledger turning a child into revenue. The same voices that praised civilization could laugh in rooms where no one was allowed to say no. In the opening scene, you were on the boat, watching the shoreline disappear. Now imagine the return trip. The guests leave before dawn, when the world is quiet and forgiving. The sea is calm again. The island shrinks behind them into a silhouette, and the men pull their cloaks tighter, as if cold is the only thing that can touch them. Ahead, the mainland lights reappear, and with them comes the old performance. The honorable senator, the respectable merchant, the refined patron of culture. The boat glides into the harbor. Sand scrapes softly under the hull. Feet step on to stone. The men vanish into the waking city, and the world accepts them as if nothing happened. Behind them, the island sits in the early light, beautiful, silent, and full of locked rooms. And the sea, endlessly moving, keeps the evidence the way it always has. Not with malice, not with mercy, but with depth.